Karen demands refund because the movie wasn't as good as the trailer. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The lights dimmed slowly as the room settled into a hushed quiet, a collective murmur of anticipation building within the walls of the multiplex theater. It was a Saturday night, the theater crowded with patrons eager to lose themselves in the magic of cinema, to escape their weekly routines and experience something larger than life. The aroma of buttery popcorn wafted through the air, mixed with the faint scent of candy and the distant hum of the concession stand. The excitement was palpable. This was the kind of movie that people had been talking about for weeks, buzzing with energy, fueled by endless rumors and wild speculations about the kind of spectacle it promised. The trailer, in particular, had generated an overwhelming amount of hype, showcasing jaw-dropping special effects, action-packed sequences, and a storyline that seemed to push the boundaries of creativity. It had all the makings of a cinematic masterpiece. For Karen, it was the film she had been waiting for, the one that was going to make her Saturday night unforgettable. Karen had been excited from the moment she first saw the trailer on her phone a few weeks ago. She could still recall the vivid images flashing across the screen, towering skyscrapers collapsing in slow motion, a hero racing against the clock to save the world, and scenes of high-octane car chases that had left her breathless. She had watched the trailer several times, her expectations growing with each view. The excitement had built so much that she couldn't help but tell her friends at work about it, convincing them that this was the movie to see. They were hesitant at first, unsure if it would live up to the hype, but Karen assured them it would be worth the price of admission. After all, if the trailer was anything to go by, the movie was bound to be a cinematic masterpiece. As Karen walked into the theater, she couldn't shake the feeling of anticipation that had been bubbling inside her all day. The air felt thick with the promise of something extraordinary. She stood in line at the concession stand, briefly considering getting a large soda and popcorn, but quickly changed her mind. She had already indulged in too many snacks during the week, and tonight was about indulging in the movie experience itself. When she finally made her way into the theater, she found her seat in the middle of the row, right where she liked it. The screen loomed ahead, and she adjusted the armrest, preparing herself for what she expected to be an unforgettable experience. As the lights continued to fade, she shifted slightly in her seat, eager for the previews to end so that the feature film could begin. The familiar sounds of the theater, the rustling of candy wrappers, the low chatter of excited conversations, gradually began to fade as the opening credits rolled on the screen. The moment had arrived. Karen leaned forward slightly in her seat, a wide grin spreading across her face as the opening sequence unfolded. The initial scenes were exactly as she had expected. The breathtaking visuals, the high stakes, the heart-pounding music, all of it felt like the trailer come to life. She could feel her heart racing in time with the action, each frame more thrilling than the last. She settled into the experience, convinced that this was going to be one of those nights that would stick with her forever. But as the film progressed, things began to shift in a way that Karen didn't quite understand. The pacing, which had initially been fast and intense, started to slow. The once perfectly crafted action scenes seemed to drag on a little too long. The dazzling visuals that had once filled the trailer with promise now felt muted, lacking the intensity she had imagined. The hero, who had seemed so dynamic in the trailer, appeared wooden and one-dimensional on the screen, lacking the depth Karen had anticipated. As the minutes stretched on, her initial excitement began to wane, replaced by a sense of confusion and frustration. Karen was having a hard time understanding what was happening. She had come here expecting to see the film she had imagined from the trailer, but what she was watching felt like something entirely different. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting back to the screen as if willing the movie to get better. The plot, which had seemed so intriguing in the trailer, felt muddled and unfocused. The characters she had been eager to learn more about now seemed flat and uninteresting. There were moments when Karen could tell that the filmmakers had tried to inject some emotional weight into the scenes, but it all fell flat, leaving her with little more than an empty feeling. The dialogue, which had sounded so snappy in the trailer, now seemed forced and awkward. It wasn't just one thing that bothered her, it was the whole experience. The movie, as a whole, wasn't living up to the hype. But the moment that truly made her question the film came about an hour into the feature. The scene that had captivated her in the trailer, the one where the hero leaps from a rooftop and narrowly escapes an explosion, never materialized. Karen's heart sank as she realized that the scene, which had been the centerpiece of the trailer's appeal, was nowhere to be found. There was a similar explosion, but it wasn't as spectacular or impactful as she had hoped. The hero's jump was clumsy, the explosion lackluster, and the entire sequence felt like a shadow of what she had imagined. She couldn't believe it. She had been so certain that the movie would deliver on the promise of the trailer, but now it was clear that the filmmakers had used clever editing and special effects to create something that was more flash than substance. As the movie continued, Karen's frustration only grew. Every scene that had made her excited in the trailer seemed to be missing or altered beyond recognition. The pacing became erratic, the plot increasingly nonsensical. By the time the film neared its climax, Karen had lost all connection to the story. The magic she had felt earlier had vanished, leaving only a lingering sense of disappointment. She could hear the occasional sound of people shifting in their seats, others whispering or checking their phones. Karen's mind raced. Was this the same film she had been so excited about? Was this really what she had been waiting for? The answer, it seemed, was no. This wasn't what she had come for. She glanced around at the other patrons. Some of them were still engrossed in the film, their eyes fixed on the screen, but others looked just as disillusioned as she felt. The occasional yawn, the rustling of popcorn bags, and the sighs of discontent filled the theater, signaling that Karen wasn't alone in her dissatisfaction. The movie was failing not just her, but many of the people around her. As the final scenes began to unfold, Karen's mind raced with the realization that she had wasted her time on something that didn't even come close to what had been promised. The promise of action and excitement had been nothing more than a well-crafted illusion. The film finally ended, and the theater slowly came back to life. The lights flickered on, and Karen found herself still sitting in her seat, numb from the experience. As the credits rolled, she didn't feel elated or satisfied as she had hoped. Instead, she felt betrayed. She stood up and made her way to the exit, her mind a whirlwind of frustration and disappointment. The excitement she had walked into the theater with was gone, replaced by a sense of injustice. She had been sold an idea, an image of something spectacular, but what she had received was something far less. And she knew that she wouldn't be able to leave the theater without doing something about it. As Karen made her way out of the theater, the weight of her disappointment pressed heavily on her chest. She could feel the stirrings of anger building within her, a quiet but relentless tide of frustration that threatened to overtake her calm facade. Her fingers tightened around the ticket stub she still held in her hand, the symbol of the money she had spent on what was, in her eyes, a blatant lie. The film, which she had eagerly awaited, had failed to live up to the promise of the trailer, and now she felt cheated, like a victim of false advertising. The images from the trailer, the explosions, the high-speed chases, the stunning visual effects, had all been carefully constructed illusions, designed to lure her in and fill her with anticipation. What she had seen in the theater, however, was nothing like what had been promised. There was no grand explosion, no heroic stunts, and no thrilling moments of action that made her heart race. Instead, she had been met with an unremarkable, slow-paced film that lacked the intensity and excitement she had imagined. As Karen exited the theater, her thoughts spiraled. The more she thought about the movie, the more her anger grew. She wasn't just upset because the film had been disappointing, she was upset because she had been duped into believing it would be something it wasn't. The trailer had sold her an experience, a story, and a spectacle, but none of it had materialized. She couldn't understand why filmmakers felt the need to manipulate audiences in such a way, offering up a tantalizing glimpse of a film that wasn't representative of its final product. This wasn't just a minor letdown, it felt like a betrayal, and Karen was determined to do something about it. She wasn't going to let it slide. She had paid for a movie ticket, expecting an adventure, a thrilling ride, and a memorable evening. Instead, she had been given a lackluster experience that left her feeling empty and disillusioned. No, she wasn't going to just leave it at that. With the steely resolve of someone who had been wronged, Karen marched up the theater's corridor toward the box office. The crowd around her was still buzzing, some people talking animatedly about the film, others sharing their own opinions on the movie's merits. But Karen didn't care about any of that. In her mind, there was only one thing that mattered now: getting her money back. She reached the counter, her eyes locking with the young employee behind the desk, a woman who was busy sorting through some paperwork. Karen's voice cut through the noise of the theater, sharp and demanding. "I want a refund," she declared, her words leaving no room for negotiation. The employee looked up, surprised by the sudden outburst but quickly masking her surprise with a neutral expression. She nodded politely and asked if Karen had enjoyed the film. Karen's frustration flared. "No, I did not enjoy it," she snapped, her voice rising slightly. "It was nothing like the trailer. You guys lied. The trailer showed all these incredible scenes, explosions, action, drama, but the movie was completely different. It was false marketing." The employee blinked, clearly taken aback by the intensity of Karen's reaction, but she kept her composure. She had dealt with upset customers before, and while this one seemed particularly heated, she was trained to handle complaints. Still, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for the frustrated woman in front of her. She had heard similar complaints before, people coming in, disappointed with a movie they had been promised would be a masterpiece, only to feel let down by the final product. But this was something different. The movie had only just been released, and Karen seemed genuinely enraged. "I'm sorry you didn't enjoy the film," the employee began, her voice calm but firm. "But unfortunately, we don't offer refunds for dissatisfaction with the content of the movie itself. The trailers are created separately from the film, and they may highlight certain aspects that don't always represent the final cut." Karen's eyes narrowed, her anger only intensifying as she listened to the explanation. She wasn't hearing it. She had heard all of this before, the usual corporate speak, the rehearsed lines about how trailers were promotional tools, not guarantees of what the film would be like. But none of that mattered to Karen. She had been sold an idea, a promise of an experience that had never materialized, and she wasn't about to let it go so easily. "No, that's not good enough," Karen insisted, her voice rising in volume. "You need to do something about this. This is false advertising, and I want my money back. I'm not leaving until I get a refund." The employee felt a flicker of uncertainty. She had dealt with irate customers before, but Karen's persistence made it clear that this wasn't a typical complaint. The woman's demeanor, her tone, her refusal to accept any compromise, it all signaled that this would be more than a simple conversation. This would be a battle, one that Karen was prepared to fight tooth and nail. Seeing that the employee wasn't backing down, Karen's gaze shifted, searching for someone in a higher position. She wanted the manager, and she wasn't about to settle for anything less. "Is the manager here?" she asked, her voice sharp with authority. The employee hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, but she's currently assisting another customer. It'll be just a few minutes." Karen stood still, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she waited. Time seemed to drag on as the employee took care of the other customers in line. Karen's mind raced with thoughts of the trailer, the film, and the injustice she felt. She was sure she wasn't the only one who had been tricked. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle of it all. She had been promised an experience, and what she had gotten in return was a hollow shell of the movie she had imagined. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the employee turned toward her with a nod, signaling that the manager was now available. Karen wasted no time. She approached the desk, her eyes locked on the woman standing behind it. The manager was calm and collected, but there was something about her demeanor that suggested she had seen her fair share of complaints. Still, Karen wasn't interested in hearing excuses. She was ready to make her case. "I demand a full refund," she stated again, this time with even more urgency in her voice. "This movie was nothing like what you promised. You need to take responsibility for this." The manager, who had been trained to handle difficult customers, remained calm. She had seen it all before, people disappointed by movies, some demanding refunds, others simply venting their frustration. But Karen's determination was different. The manager took a deep breath and asked, "What exactly was it that you didn't enjoy about the film?" Karen launched into her litany of complaints, recounting every moment of disappointment, every scene that had been falsely promised in the trailer. She spoke with such fervor that the manager could tell this was more than just a disgruntled customer. This was someone who felt deeply wronged. She listened, nodding sympathetically as Karen vented. Finally, when Karen paused for breath, the manager spoke, her voice calm but firm. "I understand that you're upset," she said. "But the truth is, we cannot offer a refund based on the film's content. However, I can offer you something else, something that might make up for the disappointment." Karen's eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping in. She wasn't interested in something else. She wanted her money back, and nothing short of that would do. "Just give me the refund, and we can be done with this," Karen insisted, her frustration mounting. "I'm not leaving until I get it." The manager sighed, preparing herself for the long road ahead. This was going to take more than a simple conversation to resolve. And Karen, it seemed, was determined to get her way, no matter what it took. The exchange between Karen and the manager had reached an impasse. The tension in the air was thick, almost palpable, as Karen stood at the counter, her arms crossed tightly, staring down the manager with an intensity that suggested this wasn't going to end easily. The manager, standing behind the desk, had remained calm throughout Karen's outbursts, but it was becoming clear that her patience was being tested to the limit. She had heard her fair share of complaints before, disgruntled customers demanding refunds, irate moviegoers venting their frustrations over films that didn't meet their expectations, but Karen's insistence, her refusal to listen to reason, was pushing this interaction into new territory. The theater had policies in place for such complaints, policies that were clear and firm, but Karen wasn't interested in hearing them. To her, it wasn't about policy, it was about being wronged, about being sold a false promise and wanting some form of justice for it. "I'm not leaving here until I get my refund," Karen repeated, her voice firm and unwavering. She wasn't playing around anymore, and it was clear that she would not back down until she got what she felt she was entitled to. The manager, a woman in her late 20s with a calm and collected demeanor, had been trying to navigate this increasingly heated conversation with tact. She had been dealing with difficult customers for years, but something about Karen's refusal to accept any resolution other than a full refund made this situation particularly challenging. She had explained, calmly and clearly, that the theater had no policy allowing refunds based on personal dissatisfaction with the film itself, especially given that trailers were promotional tools, not guarantees of what would appear on the big screen. But Karen wasn't hearing any of it. To her, the rules didn't matter. All that mattered was the experience she had been promised and the one she had actually received, and they were worlds apart. The manager tried to offer an alternative solution, as she had been trained to do. "I understand that you're upset," she said, her voice measured but empathetic. "And I'm sorry that you didn't enjoy the movie. I really am. But unfortunately, I can't offer you a full refund for a film that you simply didn't enjoy. However, I can give you a voucher for another movie, one of your choice, to make up for this experience." The offer hung in the air for a moment, the manager's hope that Karen would see reason in it almost tangible. But Karen's reaction was immediate and sharp, like a spark that set off a much larger fire. "No," Karen snapped, her voice raising slightly. "A voucher? You think I'm going to sit through another movie just to be disappointed again? That's not good enough. I paid for a movie ticket, and I want my money back. I want it now." The manager, still maintaining her calm, knew she had to remain firm, but she was starting to feel the pressure. Karen's refusal to accept any compromise was starting to feel like an attack, a personal challenge, and the manager knew she needed to stay in control of the situation. She wasn't about to let Karen's anger dictate the terms of the encounter, no matter how loud or persistent Karen became. "I'm sorry you feel that way," the manager said, her tone still composed, though she could feel the strain beginning to show. "But unfortunately, the policy is clear. We can't issue refunds simply because you didn't like the film. The trailers are produced separately from the final film, and they may highlight scenes that are not necessarily in the final cut. This is a common issue with promotional materials, and we cannot be held responsible for personal dissatisfaction. Karen's face reddened with frustration. She wasn't hearing any of it. To her, the argument about trailers and promotional materials seemed like a weak excuse, a way to deflect responsibility. She didn't care about the fine print of policies or the technicalities of film production. She had paid for an experience, and what she had gotten was far from it. She was determined to make the theater understand the magnitude of her disappointment, and she wasn't about to let the manager off the hook with corporate jargon. "That's not an excuse," Karen argued, her voice shaking with anger. "You all know the trailer is what sells the movie, and you used that to get me in here. I watched that trailer, and I was promised something epic. Instead, I get a half-baked film that doesn't even come close to what I saw in that trailer. You can't just hide behind policies and pretend like that's okay. I want a refund, or I'll be filing complaints everywhere I can think of, and I won't stop until this is taken care of." The manager felt a flicker of frustration rising within her, but she tamped it down. She had been through countless complaints over the years, some of them far more unreasonable than Karen's, but the sheer determination in Karen's eyes made this one feel different. Karen wasn't just frustrated, she was now threatening to escalate the situation, to make it a public matter, and that made it harder for the manager to simply dismiss the request as one more disgruntled customer. "You're threatening to make this public, but I'm afraid that won't change our policy," the manager said firmly, her tone finally taking on a hint of resolve. "I understand that you're upset, but we cannot offer a refund. However, if you'd like to file a formal complaint, I can give you the contact information for our customer service department. They handle these kinds of situations, and they can look into it further. But as far as I'm concerned, this matter is resolved." Karen's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a tight line. She wasn't going to let it go that easily. The manager's suggestion that she file a formal complaint only seemed to fuel Karen's anger, and she was now operating on a level that felt almost unstoppable. She had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to accept anything less than a full refund, and she wasn't going to let this end with a simple no. "I don't want to deal with customer service," Karen shot back, her voice cutting through the air. "I want you to fix this now. You're the manager, so it's your responsibility to make this right. You're telling me that I'm just supposed to accept this and walk away? That's not happening. Not now, not ever." The manager sighed inwardly, steeling herself for what she knew was about to come. Karen wasn't going to back down, and neither was she. The conversation was quickly turning into a standoff, a battle of wills, and the manager knew that it was going to take more than just polite negotiation to resolve it. She had to remain firm, even if it meant this conversation would drag on longer than either of them wanted. "Ma'am," the manager began, her voice steady but with an edge of finality creeping in, "I understand your frustration, but the policies are in place for a reason. We can't make exceptions, no matter how much you argue. If you're not satisfied with our offer, I'm afraid there's nothing more I can do. You're welcome to contact customer service, but I cannot give you a refund for this movie. It's not something we're allowed to do." Karen stood in front of her, unmoving, her arms still crossed. The manager could see the fire in her eyes, the unwavering determination, and she knew that the next few moments would be crucial. Would Karen finally accept that there was no way forward? Or would she dig in her heels, pushing this encounter into a confrontation that neither of them could walk away from easily? For a brief moment, the two women locked eyes, and in that silence, the tension seemed to stretch, thick and uncomfortable, like a rope pulled taut. Neither of them spoke, the only sound in the room the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant chatter of moviegoers exiting the theater. Then, finally, Karen spoke again, her voice low and dangerous. "I'm not done with this," she muttered. The manager braced herself for what was coming next. She knew Karen wouldn't leave easily, and whatever was about to happen would only escalate the situation further. The silence between Karen and the manager seemed to stretch for what felt like an eternity, the air thick with the tension of an unresolved conflict that neither side seemed willing to let go. Karen stood firm, her arms still crossed tightly, her face red with anger, her eyes narrow slits of frustration. She was not going to back down. She had come into that theater expecting a cinematic adventure, a night of excitement and exhilaration, and what she had been given instead was a disappointing, slow-moving film that failed to live up to the promises made in the trailer. She had paid good money for that experience, and in her mind, the theater needed to make it right. The manager, however, had made it clear that she was not about to offer any kind of refund, and every attempt to explain the policy seemed to fuel Karen's fire rather than extinguish it. It was no longer about the movie, about the plot or the action scenes, it was about principle. Karen felt personally wronged, and she wasn't going to let the manager's polite deflections sway her. If she had to push this issue to its limits, she would. The manager, on the other hand, had reached a point where her patience was beginning to fray. She had explained everything she could, had offered a voucher for a future film, and had even suggested Karen contact customer service if she felt the need to escalate things further. But Karen wasn't having any of it. She wasn't interested in compromises or explanations, she was interested in getting her money back, and she was making that crystal clear with every word, every gesture, every glare. The manager could feel the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. She had dealt with unruly customers before, people angry over small issues, people looking for refunds or discounts for things that weren't necessarily the theater's fault, but this was different. Karen wasn't being irrational. She was upset, yes, but she was also right in one thing: the trailer had sold a product that the movie hadn't delivered. It wasn't about the content of the film itself, but rather the misrepresentation of what that content was going to be. The manager understood this intellectually, but policy and procedure dictated how things had to be handled. And according to those rules, there was nothing more she could offer. Finally, after what seemed like a long and drawn-out standoff, the manager sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of the frustration mounting within her. She glanced at the ticket counter behind her, momentarily distracted by the movements of the other staff members handling a steady stream of customers. This was the busy part of the night, and her attention was being pulled in different directions as people continued to flood out of the theaters, murmuring about the movie, some of them commenting on how good it was while others, like Karen, walked away disgruntled and irritated. The manager couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for Karen, but she quickly reminded herself that she was the one on the front lines, the one who had to enforce the rules. And Karen, in her mind, was pushing those rules past their breaking point. She couldn't give in, not without compromising the integrity of the entire operation. Still, she wasn't sure how much longer she could stand her ground. She glanced at Karen again, this time with a soft sigh, trying to find some common ground in the growing storm of tension. "I can't give you a full refund," the manager said quietly, almost resigned to the fact that this conversation was going nowhere. "You know that, right? You've heard everything I've said. I've offered you a voucher, I've explained our policy, and I've even given you the option to escalate this with customer service. But I cannot issue a refund." The finality in her voice was clear, but she could sense that Karen wasn't finished. Not yet. She watched as Karen's eyes narrowed further, her jaw tightening with a renewed sense of determination. It was clear that Karen had come here expecting a fight, and by God, she was going to get one. Karen, feeling the weight of the manager's refusal pressing down on her, clenched her fists at her sides. She had been hoping for a different response, one that would show that the theater cared about its customers, about providing a quality experience. Instead, she felt like she had been brushed aside, her concerns dismissed as just another complaint. "You really think this is going to end with a voucher?" she spat, her voice low but tinged with venom. "I don't care about your vouchers. I don't want to sit through another movie here and waste more of my time. I want a refund for the money I spent tonight. I've made it clear, and I'm not going to leave without it." For a moment, the manager simply stood there, her face a mask of professional detachment, but internally she was beginning to feel the cracks forming in her calm exterior. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a power struggle. Karen was not about to let go, and the manager was determined not to bend the rules for her. They were at an impasse, locked in a silent battle over who would yield first. The thought of escalating the situation, of letting it spiral further out of control, was something the manager didn't want to entertain. But the longer Karen pushed, the more it seemed like there was no easy way out. The manager took a deep breath, her decision made. Okay, here's what I'll do, she said, her voice steady and unwavering. I'm going to offer you a compromise, something that's never been done before, but I hope you understand that this is a one-time thing. I will give you a partial refund, just to show that we value you as a customer and understand your frustration, but it's not going to be the full amount. I cannot go beyond that. Take it or leave it. The words hung in the air, thick with tension. The offer, though far less than what Karen had demanded, was the closest the manager could get to a resolution. She watched Karen closely, anticipating her response. Would she accept it, or would this standoff continue indefinitely? Karen's eyes widened, and for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. She had pushed hard, fought tooth and nail for what she thought was fair, and now, here was the manager offering something that was, in her mind, a reasonable compromise. It wasn't the full refund she had demanded, but it was something, and for a moment, Karen's frustration ebbed away, replaced by a sense of reluctant acceptance. After all, she had pushed the manager to the point of offering something, which, in Karen's mind, felt like a small victory. She had been persistent, unyielding, and in the end, she had gotten some form of acknowledgement for her dissatisfaction. For a long moment, Karen stood silently, her gaze locked on the manager as she considered the offer. The manager remained quiet, giving her the space to process, to decide whether she would accept the compromise or continue down this path of confrontation. Finally, Karen let out a deep sigh, her shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation seemed to lift from her. She met the manager's eyes and nodded slowly. Fine, she muttered, her voice softer now, tinged with reluctant resignation. I'll take it. But don't think I'm ever coming back here. The manager nodded, a small but appreciative smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Thank you for understanding. I'll process the partial refund right away. As Karen turned to leave, her frustration still simmering but now tempered by the resolution, the manager watched her go. She felt a strange sense of relief, knowing the situation was finally over. The tension, the back and forth, the emotional exhaustion, it had all reached its conclusion, and in the end, both sides had compromised. Karen might never return to the theater, but at least, for now, she was leaving with something, and the manager had managed to hold firm to the policies that governed the theater. The battle had been won, not by Karen, but by the manager, who had stood her ground despite the intense pressure. As Karen walked out the door, her figure disappearing into the night, the manager let out a slow breath, knowing that while this particular conflict was over, the world of customer service would always be filled with challenges like this one.